Hey, I'm Alec Bemis, and I'm at the Mercury Lounge in New York City. I run a record label called Brassland, and I am a freelance writer and journalist, mostly about music, for the LA Weekly, the LA Times, and many other publications. Well, I guess the label that I have now, it started in a weird form. I had a cassette label when I was in high school, and but I also did a fanzine. And it was funny because at the time, it's hard to even conceive of the fact that people had cassette labels, but I think I started around the same time as those Saddle Creek people. I remember I actually even sort of remember at my fanzine getting copies of Conor Oberst cassettes in like 1995 or something like that, and having no idea what to do with it. But yeah, so it all started just as an interest in music. I started this magazine, this fanzine called Jaboni Youth, and I had this cassette label called Brassland. I guess when I was in high school, give a more succinct answer, I started a magazine, fanzine called Jaboni Youth, and a cassette label called Brassland. And the fanzine sort of, I guess, evolved into writing and being interested in sort of talking and discussing music, and the label sort of died for a number of years in college and then restarted when I got out as a CD making label and a sort of more real record label. I guess one gets an assignment at a paper by sort of meeting editors and getting them to like you and be interested in you for some reason. Initially, I started writing for papers just literally sending piles of clips, I think college newspaper clips, to random editors I saw on the masthead, and I was lucky enough to get a note back. It's definitely a competitive thing, but I think it can also be, on some level, not so competitive because the financial rewards, especially when you're starting out, are very sort of minor. But going forward, I just developed relationships with editors who are interested in what I have to say, and that's kind of how it works. I think I learned how to write by, frankly, doing it, by just writing a lot, and that's actually why I would even bring my journalism career back to when I was doing this fanzine, because literally it was something I did in the suburbs because I was bored, and I listened to a lot of records and wrote a lot of record reviews, and you just sort of very quickly learn, there are certain sort of phrases and ideas in describing music that come up again and again and again, and the more you do it, the more you sort of realize it's almost like you understand cliches by having gone through the cliches again and again and again. And not that rock critics aren't famous for their cliches, but I like to think, at least in my writing, that I avoid them a little bit because of that sort of beating themselves out of me, like exercising them sort of demon style. But I also, at school, at college, I definitely took writing classes and was sort of given advice on craft, but I think a lot of the best test of writing is just writing, and the best way to gain experience. I have different relationships with different papers. It starts off as a one-off deal. You get something, you place something in a paper, you hope that they like it, and then you pitch a new idea. It's definitely, the pitch is really important. You sort of, in a succinct, 150 words or less kind of way, you basically have to have some kind of hook into a story, or a record review, or a concept that either other people don't have, or just is interesting enough for the editor to think that it's something worth expanding into something longer. But I've also had writing contracts with papers where they sort of get some measure of exclusivity on what you do, and they give you X amount of dollars a year. So it's a little bit of security for you, and for them, they'll only do that if they really like what you're producing. It kind of gives them a sort of branded name that they can sort of develop and build a relationship with. For most of my writing, I think I've been a little unusual in that I really have never taken assignments for the most part. I couldn't really see the point. I like to write about what I'm excited about, and again, it goes back to sort of my fanzine days. But there's definitely, especially with the glossier the magazine, the more likely you have to kind of just listen to what the editor wants you to write about. I've also written for magazines like Blender, and I'm trying to think. That one was one where I actually did take not pitches, but sort of assignments from the editors, but it never really worked out for me because I was like, why am I listening to this record and trying to evaluate it for a couple $100. Like, it's just a waste of my time. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of freelancers out there who make their living by going through piles of 10 or 20 records and just writing little reviews about them and knocking them off. So, my personal interest is in interactions with the musician and figuring out sort of how they came to what they came to. So I love Q&As. I've become totally addicted to them recently. Just sort of sitting down and getting a musician's own words about what they do. And, sometimes there's just a little bit of, restructuring the order in which they say a sentence just to sort of make it parse correctly. But kind of turning a conversation with a musician into some kind of narrative, that's what excites me most. Record reviews, they almost seem more useless to me now than they ever have. I think we're really going through a kind of exciting, interesting moment in journalism, and music journalism in particular, because the whole medium of the record is changing, and I don't think people are really listening to full records quite like they once did, at least not all kinds of artists. There's definitely a genre of artist where the record is the thing, but singles are on more even footing than they've been in a long time. So reviews always kind of bored me. Live reviews I like a little bit more because there's this whole sort of experience narrative element to it. Yeah. I like writing about live shows because it's as much about what's happening on stage as what's happening on the audience. And I think, no one wants to read a concert review of Bruce Springsteen where you talk about how someone spilled a beer on you. But at the same time, there's definitely always an energy of what the room looks like and what the performers are sort of doing on stage and the witty banter that happens between them and the audience. And I always find that a little more interesting. I've sort of stopped doing them because it definitely involves a lot of pounding the pavement. I think, that's actually what a lot of daily newspapers do best. The New York Times and the LA Times, that's kind of their bread and butter, I think, is their music coverage. Because it really is, it feels like news. It feels like an event. It's not just this document. So it's the closest thing to reporting probably a music journalist can do. Profiles are a whole different thing. They can be reporting, but to me, it's more like psychology. It's like sitting down and having a sort of doctor's visit with a musician because, artists are crazy, as they say, and it's always great, especially if someone's been able to sort of shape their craziness into this beautiful thing, and that to me is what a profile is. I think we have something like 6 artists on Brassland, maybe 4 are active at any given time. My record label is very much this sort of little sort of intentional community of musicians. I started it with a pair of twin brothers, one of whom I went to college with, and one of whom was sort of going to school an hour away. They're both in this band. That's Aaron Desner and Bryce Desner. They're in this band called The National, which has gone to some success. They sell 100,000 records, which in the indie world in which we operate is a pretty good thing. And at the time, Aaron and Bryce were playing in The National, and Bryce had this sort of side project called Clogs, a classical quartet with this 45-year-old Australian guy who had been in a bunch of symphony orchestras and been a very high-level sort of strings player. And then it kind of had some troubles, spent 7 years in an ashram in sort of the middle of Australia. I don't really know what he did there, but apparently a lot of yoga and thinking. And then he got a Fulbright to the United States, to the Yale School of Music, and finished his education. So these were the sort of 2 poles that we started with, this sort of contemporary classical group and this indie rock band. And the roster has kind of developed around those 2 groups. So we've brought in this cello player named Eric Friedlander, who I think is in his mid-40s or something like that, and he's probably one of the better freelance cellists, definitely in New York, and probably by virtue of that in the world. Today I actually talked to him, and he was playing on a Judy Collins album, and he's played with Courtney Love and Maxwell and all kinds of ridiculous things. Great classical stuff too. There's guys Osvaldo Golejov that I was recently listening to, and I saw that Eric Friedlander was in the credits. But we do his solo albums because he has a relationship with Bryce. And there's this electronic pop musician named Baby Dayliner, who we've done 2 albums with. And we ended up with him just because The National really liked going to see his show in Manhattan. So we've kind of very consciously molded it as a little family. It's gotten extended. Right now I'm chauffeuring around Manhattan this band Devastations, who are from Australia, and were recently nominated for this thing called the AMP Award, which is the Australian Music Prize. It's kind of their equivalent of the Mercury. But it's always sort of it's all through direct relationships and things like that. The future of my record label is kind of in a weird place right now and uncertain. And we've talked about it amongst ourselves, me and Bryce and Aaron, and I think we kind of think of it as in the same way as like with a family, like you have a kid and it grows up and it might, become a doctor, it might want to be a musician. Like the bands on my label, I don't really have any desire to hold on to them forever. I think we really think of ourselves as sort of a development label and sort of letting people go on to bigger and better things. So if one day we're left with kind of no one that we're particularly interested in work, it's also, familial in that we really only want to work with someone that we feel this very close connection to. So if one day we turn around and there's no one to work with that we're particularly interested in, I think it might just sort of dissolve or just rely on back catalog, and I can go on to do different things. I actually just took over, I'm managing this label Cantaloupe Records right now, this contemporary classical label owned by this performing group called Bang in a Can. So, we all kind of go off and do different things. Our flagship band, The National, got signed to Beggars Banquet recently for their last record. And yeah, we don't really see anything wrong with that as long as there's sort of a good understanding between the two parties of what's happening. All's good. For me personally, it feels like it's important to be in New York or LA or to visit those places or have relationships in those places. And I think if you want to sort of be in the game in some way, you need to be. Although, a label like I was talking about earlier, Saddle Creek, have really sort of proven that doesn't have to be true. And I do think there's something of I think you don't have to be in New York or LA, but you need to be near a center of power somehow in the music industry. And I think very much like in Chicago, there's a kind of alternative music industry that sort of exists with labels like Touch and Go and Thrill Jockey and even Victory Records, which I guess does a lot of emo and sort of young poppy, punky kind of things. So I think it helps to be near one of them, or at least make frequent visits to them. But also, you can get around it. There's things like South by Southwest, CMJ. If you go to those and, make enough phone calls, it can sort of erase a lot of that distance. And I think the internet has very much changed things. If you talk to the Saddle Creek people who discovered Bright Eyes and The Faint and Cursive, and everyone knows Bright Eyes because he sold 500,000 records, but they have a couple 100,000 sellers and lots of 50,000, 30,000 sellers in their catalog. If you talk to them, they very much say, like, the internet is really what changed everything and what allowed us to do this from Omaha, Nebraska. If I didn't foreground it, yeah, Saddle Creek's a label from Omaha, Nebraska. It's totally weird. The piracy question is an interesting one. I don't think... I'm more of the school that thinks piracy is way overstated as a problem. I'm also not... I have no interest in making or selling records that are going to sell more than, 1 million copies. Frankly, I probably realistically don't have much interest in selling records that are going to sell more than 300,000 copies, and those are the people that I think it's affecting the most. People that want to be global superstars. I would love to have a global superstar on my album, but that's not my goal. And I think the businesses it's affecting, it's people that were really sort of designed for that mass popularity. I think for an indie label like myself, actually, piracy definitely occurs. I mean, I know how many copies of various records we've sold, and there's a couple national records in our catalog that we've sold, like 8,000 copies, yet they'll play 1,000-seat shows all around the country, and everyone will know the lyrics to their songs. So obviously, someone's hearing that music somehow, and I'm not getting paid for it in every case, and that's kind of fine. I mean, I think for an indie label, its awareness is really the struggle more than it is sort of mass popularity. So, for us, actually, if something sells 10,000 copies, it's not the worst thing in the world. That's a good start. I think the infrastructure has to be built up around this desire for music on the internet. We do right now sell through iTunes and eMusic and Rhapsody and Napster and all these things, as well as physical CDs. But the infrastructure is not quite there yet. Like, people really need to be able to get music at a low price, and and get a lot of it, because I think that's sort of where we're at. We're sort of the iPod generation now, and people want to fill a hard drive. They want to fill an 80 gig hard drive with music, and we came from this era of scarcity and sort of understanding music in a very different way. I think music in the digital era has to become something more like cable television, where it's just you turn it on and lots and lots of content flows through, and it can constantly change. And I think my label will benefit from that, and I think it already has. I mean, I've been amazed in recent months where suddenly, I heard amazing statistics where people are surprised when a record is selling 25% of its total digitally. But I'm looking at my sales numbers recently, and half of our sales are digital, half of our sales are physical in a lot of months. It can be a very close proportion. And that basically almost means that the whole physical infrastructure for getting records is failing in some way. If people are obviously, I think their first choice still is to get a physical record. And I think what's happening is people are going in, looking for our records, not seeing them in a store, and able to find them online through eMusic or iTunes, et cetera, et cetera. So again, yeah, like there's the piracy question, but I think that's just how you frame it. To me, it's like the digital sort of opportunity with records, and it's a great thing. Our physical CDs are distributed through a company in Chicago called Southern Records, which then sells to 1,000,001 sub-distributors. Forced Exposure in Boston, somewhere in Massachusetts. There's this place called Revolver in San Francisco, Surefire in Vermont. They also sell to Fontana, which is a sort of indie distribution imprint of Universal. So they kind of make their way out there. And I, frankly, haven't spent too much time figuring out how, because my whole job is like raising demand for the records, and I've done the occasional retail program here and there, but there's not much I can do beating the door down at retail to make them stock and sell our records. I've always focused on consumer demand and consumer awareness, and making sure that the bands are making great music and are happy, and that's kind of my job as I see it. We haven't paid much in the way of advances. I mean, we're pretty open about our deal. It's kind of, again, it's this like Chicago sort of model that supposedly Saddle Creek has used, although I imagine it might have changed a little once they started selling 300, 400, 500,000 records. But it's basically a 50-50 deal we do with bands. So it's, we're going to spend X money. That's sort of recoupable against earnings, and we're going to try to make more money than we spend, and then whatever is left, we will split, and that's kind of the deal. That was, from what I understand, it was a model pioneered by like Discord Records, a sort of punk rock label out of Washington, D.C., and Touch and Go Records out of Chicago. And it works. It definitely has its downsides and limitations, and you can't spend $8 gajillion on a band if you're paying them 50% of your profits, because the money is sort of tighter. Whereas like the traditional record deal, I guess, is you hope for like a 15-20% royalty, and you get really excited, but then you're seeing more money on the front end. So it's been amazing. I mean, Aaron and Bryce and I, we put in a very sort of small sum of money initially, and we've pretty much funded everything off sales. And occasionally, at one point we got an advance from our distributor, and initially, but again, a very small figure, like under not even 5 figures. I'm talking about investments, and things have just kind of sustained themselves on sales. And there's definitely been months where we look in the bank account and there's like $5 left, although that doesn't really happen so much anymore. But yeah, our whole business model is just extremely pragmatic. It's not looking to sort of hit the lottery or get huge infusions. And that's how we understand that venture. I mean, I think personally, all of us, Aaron and Bryce now have bands that are sort of dealing with bigger labels and working more on the advance, kind of get a not so great deal model. And I'm, starting to get involved with other record companies where they pay, advances and don't necessarily pay as big a percentage of royalties. But I generally look for something that I feel like 10 years from now I could listen to it and there isn't any trend that the music would be a part of. I look for kind of like, it sounds so cliche, but strong songwriting, good musicianship. Although I don't think good musicianship is necessary for good music. I think sometimes like inspired amateurism can really get good results. But yeah, I look for sort of very classic sounding bands, and I think that's given us groups that we've never put anything out that like overnight has blown up and we've sold, tens of thousands of copies, but a lot of our bands have consistently grown. So I'd look for room for growth too. That's, I think, another thing. Because I don't have huge sums of money to give a band, if they're already a superstar, there's a good chance that they're going to be able to do slightly better than me. My first piece of advice to anyone that wants to run a record label is usually you don't really want to run a record label because it's really difficult and sort of nigh impossible. I think especially now, my first piece of advice though, beyond that, you shouldn't run a record label. And my second piece of advice is if you want to do it anyway, then okay, you should run a record label. But I guess my first piece of advice would be make relationships with artists. Whether it be my label or on a much bigger level, a label like Saddle Creek, a lot of the sort of young, big indie labels that have sort of popped up of late, I think having a relationship with some kind of core artist that you really think is going to sort of go the distance is how a lot more things are going to get built. And, even if you start off sort of wending your way through the sort of traditional record industry, working, as a publicist or a radio promoter and trying to make your way into A&R, your relationships with artists will be more important in the long term than any relationship you're going to have with another sort of business person. Not that business people aren't important, but if an artist is dedicated to you and you're dedicated to them, that will sort of give you a more solid footing than any sort of business relationship will ever give you.